Onumara from We4We TV, and today we have a special guest. Um, and our guest today is none other than David KOREN. Some may have known about him, and some may have not. Mr. KOREN, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, who exactly is David KOREN for the benefit of those that may not know who you are? Can you introduce yourself briefly, sir?
Okay, my name is David KOREN, and I live in western Pennsylvania on a small farm and keep myself busy taking care of that. I've also I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer from Nigeria, and I am part of an organization of the returned Peace Corps volunteers called Friends of Nigeria. And we still stay active and involved with what's happening in Nigeria and fund some projects, even though the Peace Corps has not been in Nigeria since 1970. Those of us who served there still remember it fondly.
So, how did you get involved with the Peace Corps? At what age, and what was your interest with the Peace Corps? How did you enlist? How did it work?
I was a student at Cornell University.
Cornell's in New York?
Cornell, New York, yes.
Okay.
I lived in Ithaca, New York, near Cornell for a while. So, anyway, I went to, at Cornell, I made friends with another student called Bob Buckle, and he had become friends with Dr. Ben Nzeribe, who was from eastern Nigeria, and he had completed his PhD at Cornell and then went back to his place at Awamama to develop his own town. And one of the things he did was to start his school there, the community grammar school, and he invited my friend Bob to come and teach with him for about 9 months. And Bob did. He came back and he wrote a book which I still have. It's called Not for Ourselves Alone.
Not for Ourselves Alone.
That was the motto of the school. And so I bought the book from him for about $1, and I read it, and it was just fabulous. I thought this would be a tremendous idea, you know, after going to Cornell before I start a job, to see if I could do something like this. I mean, I was always interested in, you know, what was going on in the world and that. So soon after that, the Peace Corps started, and John Kennedy started the Peace Corps, and so I signed up, and not knowing where I would be sent, I ended up going very near to Awamama over at Amogugu near Omahia.
Wow.
So I taught English and literature and general science there for 3 years, in 1964 and 5 and 6. And during that time is when the problems were developing that led to the war. And the massacres and the coups and all that. So I saw it all evolving and happening. And while this was going on, I was teaching school. I was having the time of my young life. I really enjoyed it there. You know, I had a motorcycle, and I was roaring around the back roads of West Africa, having a great time. But so I really loved the place and the people, my students, and all that. So I left at the end of 1966, before the war started. But when I was back in the United States, I followed what was happening read the New York Times and could see what was going on. And then, you know, the starvation all started, and I got a call from somebody who was looking for volunteers to go back and help with relief efforts. And they called me because I used to live there. and they called on other former Peace Corps volunteers too, and some of us answered the call and we went. And I got assigned to UNICEF, working with the airlift out of Sao Tome, the church.
Sao Tome, right?
Sao Tome, yeah.
Okay.
That was different than the Red Cross airlift out of Fernando Po.
Oh, okay.
They were separate, and Sao Tome was formed by a group of churches, Protestant and Catholic, international Protestant, international Catholic, but mainly out of Northern Europe, Danish,
Okay.
and then, so they got the airlift started and ran it from the island, and then planes would come in at night and land, and they have to fly at night to avoid the MiGs.
Wow.
And so we would come in. There was no navigation lights, no radar. There was just a single beacon hanging from a tree over the airstrip at Uli.
Wow.
And the pilots would have this instrument in the cockpit with a needle showing that they were on the right course because they were headed for that beacon.
Mm-hmm.
And when the needle in the cockpit swung, it meant they were right over the airstrip.
Mm-hmm.
So then they did some maneuvers in the dark and lowered down the plane, and hopefully they were lined up with the end of the runway. And then they called for runway lights because the intruder, the Nigerian bomber, was overhead, and he was waiting to get his fix so he could have a target to roll his bombs. And so we had to wait till the last second to turn on the lights and come in. And it was scary. But anyway, that was my job that I was recruited to do, was to help unload the planes as fast as possible. So I was to supervise a crew of Biafran Air Force workers, and we were to get the planes unloaded as fast as possible to get them out of there, away from the bombs, but also have enough time to get back to Sao Tome,
Wow.
to load up again and come back. And so many planes made 2 trips every night, and some of them were fast enough to make 3.
Wow.
So those planes carrying about 10 tons of cargo, making 3 runs a night from just sunset to sunrise. You had to get out before sunrise because you had to go out by Port Harcourt where the MiGs were stationed.
Mm-hmm.
So in that time, we could carry like 30 tons of food in a single night. And over time, the airlift became more organized and focused, and more planes and more people. And at one point, Uli airstrip was considered the second busiest airport in all of Africa after Johannesburg.
Wow. Uli airstrip?
Yeah. So we got,
So it was that busy despite the dangerous circumstances that existed back then?
Yes, it was. We lost some planes and air crew. And there were crashes, and so the air crew were buried at the church. I think it's St. Teresa's Catholic Church, right at Uli, right along our approach. When we came in at night, in the landing lights or the moonlight, we could see the steeples of this church right beside the road. And we swooped down right beside it. But anyway, the ones who were killed were buried in that church.
God bless them.
So, yeah, but the other thing we did, there was an interest, particularly to me, was that after we unloaded our planes, sometimes they brought to us young children who were like in the last stage, about to starve to death. There was just no other chance left for them. And they brought them to us, and we flew them back to South Tome, and they're an orphanage run by some Catholic nuns, took care of them, restored them to health, and later were able to return them to their villages, because they kept very good records. So they had pictures of the kids. They had forms signed by their parents with the parents' names, the father, the mother, the village they were from, the sponsoring. So it were very, very well documented. And anyway, they got back. But to me, that was...
Were there, sorry, about this particular incident, were there cases where the children came back and their parents were no more there and stuff like that?
Yeah, because I saw a film of a father handing his children, his little girl, over the desk to the nuns, and quickly signing the paper authorizing this, and that man was as thin as a stick, because he was starving himself, and you can imagine what they felt like. I mean, when you have to give your own child to a stranger to carry them far away in the sky somewhere with the last hope that they may live, and then, so some of those parents may not have survived. And some, there were kids who were repatriated after the war, who, they couldn't find their families because they'd gone as refugees here or there, they died or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so they were cared for by, they set up organizations in former Biafra to care for these people. Probably in the villages where they came from, because they knew that really was.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, this book, Far Away in the Sky.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write it? How did you come about the concept of putting this book in writing, and what's the story behind it?
Okay. About 40 years after after Biafra, I had pretty much forgotten all about it, but it was always there in the back of my mind. I remember some of the tough times of the bombing and that, but it was about that time that Chimamanda Adichie released her book, Half of a Yellow Sun. Mm-hmm. And because I belonged to this fond organization, Friends in Nigeria, the publisher said that they would give a free book to any of these former Peace Corps volunteers who told their Biafra story. And so I said, okay, I can do that. And I made the promise, and then I had to start writing it. Mm-hmm. While I was there in the Peace Corps those 3 years, I wrote home to my mother all the time. And she saved all those letters.
Wow. Each and every one of them.
Yes. And a big stack, and kept them nice in a bag. They were safe. And so she handed them to me and said, here, you need to write this. It's a good story. So that was the 3 years that I was there. Then when I was working for the airlift, I also had an audio tape recorder. And so I recorded live on tape a lot of the stuff that went on during the airlift. And all those things were in the back of my closet in an old box.
Wow.
So I got them out, and it took maybe at least a year of just going through all the old tapes. Some of them didn't work anymore. I worked with a friend to restore them. And when I heard this stuff on the tape, it was like, wow, because if we hadn't fixed it, everything I said on there would be completely lost in history. But we got it. We recaptured a lot of that. And so, I could tell the story by putting together all those things, the letters, the tapes, Plus, I had saved a lot of the flight reports and schedules and other documentations, and I had pictures. And so all that went into making the book. It took a long time, and it was just almost like doing an archaeological dig on my own life. Because, you know, you have memories from that time. You have a lot of things that really stick with you, the moments that can never be lost. But a lot of other detail is gone after all those years. And so when I played the tapes back to myself, wow, you know, all that was real right there. So that's the kind of stuff I put in the book.
Mm-hmm. You know, I never knew that you had these details in terms of the physical letters you wrote over 40 years ago. Almost 50 years ago.
Almost 50.
Yeah. The audio recordings and stuff. I'm very intrigued by that. I hope you can get a chance to bring copies of those when you come over to New Jersey.
Letters?
Make photocopies, because I don't want to mess with the originals just in case.
Yeah, okay, I will do that. I'll bring. No, I think I should bring the originals.
Mana mo wala. Go nyaro kuchia. Oshime